Hello, welcome back to the ongoing lecture series on the GE, the generic elective paper Individual and Society. In the previous lecture, I just gave you a very brief idea of what this paper entails and what all one can expect from this paper. Now, let us come to the introduction, right? Because if you look at the book, so I'll just show you the book. This is the book, The Individual and Society, which is being prescribed across the University of Delhi, across the various colleges, and there are different units, and this is the book published by Pearson Publication, which is the prescribed text, and I believe all of you should read from only this particular book. Look at the introduction, because in this book at the very beginning you will find an introduction which is given by the authors of this book, by the editors of this book, and this introduction is important. I will be just reading a few lines and from the screen. As you can see on the screen now, the author says that this course makes the assumption that literature is an important and relevant way of making sense of the world we live in. Though literature employs myth, metaphor, fictional characters, irony, rhyme and other devices of language that might not be seen as legitimate in more scientific subjects, by these means literature can, for example, enable the reader to enter into the experience, very important, to enter into the experience of people from other cultures and backgrounds, such as the Dalit boys rejected by a school in Valmiki's Jhutan, or a black African rejected as a tenant by a white landlady in Wole Soyinka's telephone conversation, and an opportunity to compare the two. Discussion of one text in the light of the other text is therefore important part of this course, and examination questions should, and they would definitely would encourage this. Right. So, if you look at these lines again, the idea is on the experience, right. The author says to enter the experience of people from other cultures and backgrounds. Now, this is very important because the units in this book, they delve into the experience of caste, class, gender, violence, globalization, race, so on and so forth, right. So, instead of the theories of caste, instead of the theories of violence, instead of the theories of war, we will delve into the experiences of war, right, and we will discuss how these experiences affect people. Therefore, I call I always I hold this view that Individual and Society is a very relevant paper. It's not a theoretical paper, it's a very relevant paper because it focuses primarily on the experiences of caste, on the experiences of gender, on the experiences of class, or for that matter on the experiences of race, or the the experiences of violence and its effects on our mental psyche, right. So, to successfully read this paper, even a general understanding of these issues is enough. You do not have to be subject experts or theoretical experts in this, right. So, the paper will focus on how society shapes individuals and how the individuals shape the society. So, now after the brief introduction, we just read the introduction by the editors themselves. So, after this we will now go to the first topic, and here we begin with our course contents, we begin with our syllabus. So, the first topic is the first unit, and that is Return from the Somme by the war poet Siegfried Sassoon. So, as we all know that war poets are basically the poets who wrote about war. They wrote anti-war pieces because they were able to see through the realities of war. When unprovoked the enemy attacks them, and therefore it basically shows the problems that the armed forces face for our safety, right. And basically the idea is that World War I could have been easily avoided, right, had it not been for the ego of those in power, right. So, therefore, basically in that particular situation, Siegfried Sassoon, he was a war poet who went into the army, and there he recollects, he describes his experiences as a war poet when he comes back from the offensive of the Somme. It's a very popular, war, a very popular expedition in war which happened in England, right, during the First World War. So, that was known as the Battle of the Somme. So, it was also known as the Somme offensive, which was fought between the British and the French. They both fought together against the German Empire, the Second Reich. So, at that point of time, this place Somme, it was a very popular battle because millions and millions of soldiers were lost in just trying to achieve just in just trying to attain just a few acres of lands, right. So Siegfried Sassoon went through that. He went through that ordeal, he went through that harrowing experience of being in the war, and then he just narrates how he comes back from the war, because Sassoon was able to see the reality of war. He was able to see how hatred was propagated by the masters and how they were not at all concerned with the actual problems that these soldiers were facing on the ground. And therefore, he explains his narrative, he explains and he describes what all he has seen, what all he has experienced. So look at these lines in the very beginning, in the introduction to Siegfried Sassoon's essay. Wounded in 1917, he was sent to Cornwallis in England, where he decided to defy military discipline and speak out publicly against the war. I am a soldier convinced that I am acting on behalf of soldier. I believe that this war upon which I entered as a war of defense and liberation has now become a war of aggression and conquest. I have seen and endured the suffering of the troops, and I can no longer be a party to prolong these sufferings for ends which I believe to be evil and unjust. So this is the idea that Siegfried Sassoon is telling us, that what actually began as a war of defense and liberation against the incoming German army, who attacked them unprovoked, later on it became just a sense of conquest and fulfilling the egos. And let me just digress from here and tell you that even right now in 2025, in the month of May, as I record this lecture for you all, we all know that a war had happened between India and Pakistan, but it was imperative on our part to attack Pakistan because they provoked us. It's plain cross border terrorism, right? But at the same time, India knew where to stop. So this is not going on forever, right? The idea is that war is necessary only and only if it means that you need to survive somehow. In that particular situation, war becomes necessary. But what happened in World War I? What happened when Siegfried Sassoon was writing this book, when he was writing his memoir, when he was describing all this? The rulers sent millions and millions of young men almost to be killed, and they all knew that they will be killed, but just for the fake sense of ego of the rulers, the fake sense of ego of the fat generals who never fought a battle, but they idolized battle. So that is how they glorify the battle, and in order to glorify the battle and to fill their own sense of ego, to fulfill their own sense of ego, they butchered and they forcefully sent thousands and thousands of young men and women at that point of time for war, only to be killed, and they knew all along that they had to be killed. So the war could have been stopped, the war could have been, but for the sake of a false sense of ego, false sense of pride, the Germans did it, and so did the Britishers, right? So basically Sassoon says that what began as a war of liberation, as a war of defense, actually turned into a war of hatred and conquest, right? So this is something which is wrong. If someone is attacking, they must know where to stop. Mahabharata also brings the idea of war, because war is the ultimate solution when nothing else works. When it comes to your own sense of belonging, when it comes to your own sense of individuality, when it comes when things become so problematic that you may not survive, when it comes to your own sense of survival, then war is necessary. And this is exactly what India did. They gave a befitting reply, and that was the need of the hour. And in the future too, if such a thing occurs, it will happen. So I am not saying that one has to be completely anti-war, because that is not the solution. If the enemy attacks you, I don't understand why people say that war is absolutely unnecessary. War is unnecessary, but it becomes necessary under certain pressing situations, and then we all have to rally together in favor of the nation and in favor of the armed forces, because of whom we are able to sleep peacefully, right? So in the month of May, we all know India attacked Pakistan, but except for the border areas, unfortunately, except for them, all the other places did not feel the brunt of it. Why? The main reason is that our armed forces were there to save us. So the idea is that war is absolutely unnecessary, but it becomes necessary if the idea is for your own survival, and that is exactly what India is doing. Now, from this brief digression, let us come back to the syllabus of this paper, and that is Return from the Somme. So what happened was that, Sassoon says that all sort of poetry, all sort of literature related to war is about suffering. It is not to glorify war. No one writes a poem or anything to glorify war. That is not what it is, right? You cannot glorify war so easily, because it is not glorious to die in the battle, and that's also true, right? It's not glorious. And even Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, the next poem that we'll be reading very soon, they both were friends, right? And so basically this prose extract that we are going to study, which is in your syllabus, Return from the Somme, is from the second volume of his memoirs. It describes the return of the soldier, from the Battle of the Somme on the Western Front in France in 1916. So basically it's like a recollection. It's like a recollection of Siegfried Sassoon, that when his battalion was coming back to their own country, what all they saw, what all they felt, and how did they manage to come across, right? So let us now begin with the text. Look at these lines. I watched the sun going down in glory beyond the main road to Amiens. The horizon trees were dark blue against the glare, and the dust of the road floated in wreaths. Motor lorries crept continuously by, while the long shadows of trees made a sort of mirage on the golden haze of the dust. The country along the river swarmed with camps, but the lower sun made it all seem pleasant and peaceful. After nightfall, the landscape glowed and glinted with campfires, and a red half moon appeared to bless the combatant armies with neutral beams. Very important, with neutral beams. Why neutral beams? Because nature is always neutral. It is perhaps man who kills the other man. It is perhaps one nation who attacks the other nation. But nature is always neutral, right? So basically he's describing that while returning back from war, what all he is feeling, what all he is observing. So the extract begins with, so this extract that we just now read, the opening lines of this memoir, it begins with a reference to nature, right? And also you will notice that a lot of natural imageries are visible in this extract as we read them, because here and there a lot of natural imagery is mentioned. So what it does is it gives a kind of a poetic touch to the memoir, right? Coming from a soldier's pen, and by the way, these lines are coming from a soldier's pen, a soldier who is someone whom we associate with guns and ammunitions and all sorts of violence, right? So coming from the pen of a soldier, these lines become very significant, because he's talking about nature. He says that the half moon is blessing the combatant armies with neutral beams, right? So the idea was that nature is always neutral, right? Also, if we talk about nature, nature doesn't differentiate, nature doesn't discriminate, nature is not prejudiced, right? For that matter, right? Nature doesn't differentiate. Now let us go forward. In the simplicity of his talk, as you can see on the screen, in the simplicity of his talk, there was a universal tone which seemed to be summing up all the enduring experience of an infantry division, right? And so basically he is describing the experience of the entire infantry division, the army division. Next line, he says, an hour before dawn, the road was still an empty picture of moonlight. And few lines below, if anyone spoke, it was only a muttered word. Very important lines. This entire paragraph is very important. And the mounted officers rode as if asleep. The men had carried their emergency water in petrol cans, against which bayonets made a hollow clink, except for the shuffling of feet. This was the only sound. Thus, with an almost spectral appearance, the lurking brown figures flitted past with slung rifles and heads bent forward under basin helmets. Moonlight and dawn began to mingle, and I could see the barley swaying indolently against the sky. Look at the various imageries that he has used. He has described the imagery of water, he has described the imagery of bayonets, which is a violent imagery, of course, and he is also describing the rifles, and how heads are bent forward under basin helmets because of the weight of the helmets, and moonlight and dawn is beginning to mingle. So all of this is happening, so it gives a very graphic description, a very picturesque detail of the war situation. So basically, this in this entire memoir, Sassoon is basically describing whatever he is seeing around him, and repeatedly he talks about nature. We just read a line above, an hour before dawn, the road was still an empty picture of moonlight. Again and again, he is referring to moon. Why? The reference to moon is important because moon signifies peace, tranquility. It signifies a sense of, a sense of peace, right? A sense of ease, a sense of tranquility, right? It's a pretty picture to look at. Moonlight is always pretty to look at, but the moonlight that these people are, actually seeing is in fact corrupted with the various ghastly experiences of war that these people have experienced and from whence they are returning back to, right? So that is why this juxtaposition of the moonlight in these dejected faces, it becomes very important. It becomes important to understand, right? So Sassoon repeatedly talks about nature as nature is pacifist. Nature is pacifist by its nature, you can say so, right? So it's a very graphic description. The paragraph that we just read, it's a very graphic description of how men are moving ahead, but their heads are bent low because of the weight of the helmet. Their bodies are bent low, and by the way, we'll be reading Wilfred Owen's poem very soon in the next lecture, which is carrying forward this idea to much more greater and much more graphic and much more emphatic lens, right? So Sassoon writes it, and if you read this paragraph closely, it feels as if Sassoon is actually bringing everything to the light. It all looks so real. Come to the next paragraph, read these lines. As you can see, nonetheless, I had seen something that night which overawed me. Very important paragraph. It was all in the day's work, an exhausted division returning from the Somme offensive, but for me, it was as though I had watched an army of ghosts. It was as though I had seen the war as it might be envisioned by the mind of some epic poet 100 years hence. Right? So Siegfried Sassoon is saying that maybe perhaps some other poet would write, some epic poet hundreds or maybe several years later would write an epic based on the survivors of the Somme offensive, right? So again, if you notice Siegfried Sassoon in this memoir, in this extract that we have in our syllabus, did not talk about anything which is glorious. There is no glory in war. He's not describing any glory that he's coming from, the Somme offensive, he's alive and somehow he's coming back, whether he has won the battle or whether he has been defeated, that is not the concern. So there is no sense of glory, right? So there is no glory in war. So he doesn't talk about the glory of war because there is no glory in war, and he calls his own regiment as appearing as an army of ghosts, right? So this beastly imagery, this very horrific imagery. It's a horrific imagery. He says that my friends, my battle mates, my fellow soldiers, it appeared as if I watched an army of ghosts. This is what he is saying. It appeared as if I watched an army of ghosts. So the soldiers almost become ghost-like because of the fact that they are completely disheveled. They have no sense of time and space. They are absolutely dejected. They are broken. They are injured. They are dirty. This is the reality of war that Somme, that the Battle of Somme actually gave to the people who earlier on were very, they were ardent for glory. They thought that war would be a glorious thing, to fight for the country, it would be a glorious thing. But Siegfried Sassoon is saying that it's not a glorious thing. It's very difficult because you never know what's going to happen to you. So when these people were coming back, they appeared as an army of ghosts. These ideas is very important. These ideas are very important. Army of ghosts, right? Not army of men. After the war, they have become ghosts. This is the idea that Siegfried Sassoon is trying to give us, right? So again and again, you would notice that so that is pretty much the essay. I'll just briefly talk about a few points. You will notice that nature becomes a very important element in this particular memoir. Why so? A question might come in your exam based on nature. So basically, it's like to show the violence of man and to juxtapose it with the peace and the tranquility and the unbiased nature. So the violence of man versus the peace of nature. So the author Siegfried Sassoon is juxtaposing these two facets, right, to to create the effect of the contrast of bestiality with war with the peace and tranquility of nature. So basically, as a writer, he deliberately does this to create this contrast. So we as students of literature have to understand how these, contrasts, what effects they create on our, on our reader, on a reader. So the idea is, if I ask you a question, can we categorize this as a protest against war? Is this a protest against war? So yes, of course, in a subtle manner, it definitely is a protest against war, not the way Wilfred Owen will do in the subsequent topic that I will be taking up, but yes, the ending of the passage makes it clear that when he sees an army of ghosts, he clearly gives a subhuman, a dehumanized idea to his fellow battlemates, to his fellow soldiers, that they have become an army of ghosts. They are not an army of men anymore, because they have lost their humanity in the process. They have been, they have gone through the various bestialities of war, and they have inflicted it. They have also been inflicted by the bestialities of war, and in the process, and that is the reason, Siegfried Sassoon also suffered shell shock. He was admitted to a hospital, and it is there that he actually became a friend of Wilfred Owen, right? So we have several stories of shell shock, and we have several instances, in literature also, of various characters who have been shell shocked, and then there are real life accounts as well of people who have been shell shocked by the violence, and they have completely lost their mental, capabilities, and their, they are in a very pathetic situation. So that is the effect of war. So yes, it is an anti-war memoir, it's an anti-war piece of literature, of course, but in a subtle manner, right? At the same time, he says that the war is not glorious. It is basically because he saw an army of ghosts returning from the battle. So an army of men went into the battle, and then what came back was an army of ghosts. So this is the larger idea that Sassoon is trying to tell us, and it's very important to understand that. So you will notice that this entire prose extract, it's very descriptive in nature, isn't it? It's very descriptive in nature. So he describes the various visuals, the sounds, of war, to create an almost realist and almost, gothic realist war-like situation, to create a graphic effect on the readers, right? So the bayonets, banging, the the clinking sound that is coming, and how these people are slinging their rifles. So it creates a very, memorable experience for the readers, because it appears very graphic, it appears very real, So the tone also, let me just briefly talk about the tone. The tone of the passage, it's an eerie tone, it's a scary tone, dark, ominous tone that he is describing, and the imagery that is predominantly used is the natural imagery, right? So the natural descriptions versus the paraphernalia of warfare that is being described here, you can say so. So it creates a profound effect on the readers, because first he describes, if you look at the way this essay is structured, what is first described? First is described the pacifist nature, the beauty of nature, the calmness of nature in the beginning, and then later on towards the end of this paragraph, we are described what? An army of ghosts. That is, we are described the bestialities of war, we are described the horrors of war. So what actually began in a very sensitive manner, in a very a tranquil manner, by describing the nature, ends in a very horrific manner, this particular essay, this particular short excerpt that we have. So thus creating a sense of a contrast to make readers think about the futility of war. So these contrasts make us think about the futility of war, and how war shapes humans, and how war completely destroys humans. So what went as an army of men later on came back as an army of ghosts. So this is the idea that Siegfried Sassoon is telling us. So here I end this brief discussion on Siegfried Sassoon's return from the Somme. I hope it gave some food for thought for everyone to understand that war is something which is unnecessary, right? And war is something which is wrong, of course, because it actually there is this very famous quote by Mahatma Gandhi when he said that the damage that war does is permanent. He says that he objects to violence because even when violence appears to do good, that good is only temporary, but the evil and the damage that it does, it is permanent, right? On this note, I would end this lecture. I would end the lecture on Siegfried Sassoon. Please stay tuned with me. I'll be taking subsequent lectures of each and every unit of this paper, GE, Individual and Society. I'll be taking up the next topic, that is the very, very popular and a very a very emphatic poem by Wilfred Owen, Dulce et decorum est. it is not glorious to die for one's country. Please stay tuned, look at the next lecture. I'll see you very soon. Thank you so much. Do comment, do like, do share this video, and I hope to resolve some of your comments in the subsequent lectures. Thank you. Goodbye for now. Jai Hind.